Putin will not be replaced by a nice man. I mean, the thing we're certain of, it will be a man. But nobody who is around Putin is likely to be that different. So we're playing for Putin, the next but one after Putin, if we're trying to get back on terms with Russia.
Russian gas company Gazprom announced it would not resume supplies to Europe after discovering a fault in the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, just hours after G7 ministers agreed to impose a price cap on Russian oil. Well, sanctions and energy supplies have become the weapons of choice for now. But Tobias Ellwood, chair of the Commons Defence Committee, is concerned it won't be long before powers like Russia turn to other weapons against the West. Yesterday on Times Radio, he gave this grave warning.
We're in for a very, very difficult decade. Our world will change. I suspect, horrible to say so, that we will see a tactical nuclear weapon used in the next 10 years. I hope that will then wake people up to say, wow, life is going to get dangerous. What are we going to do about it?
So are we hurtling in that direction? And what can stop further escalation? Let's speak now to Michael Clarke, former Director General of the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning.
What do you make of the threat from Russia right now when we take into account everything that's happening in Ukraine, the fact that they have now closed down Nord Stream 1 pipeline? How big is that threat from Russia?
Well, the immediate threat is very big in terms of giving us a miserable winter, because what Mr. Putin wants to do, the Russians need a pause in Ukraine for an offensive next year. And during that pause, they would like to detach the West from giving so much aid to Ukraine. So by creating an energy crisis, which leads into a fuel crisis and a food crisis and so on, by giving everybody a miserable winter in Europe, they're hoping that the consensus in the West to help Ukraine will wear very thin. And, it's a pretty obvious tactic. It's not very clever, but it will make for a miserable winter for sure.
And obviously the decision to close the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, or should I say not reopen it after this fault, came directly after the G7 ministers, finance ministers, agreed to bring in a cap on Russian oil. I mean, before we talk about whether that antagonised Putin and how much, do you think that is a practical approach and a realistic approach to deal with this problem, when we bear in mind that India and China aren't part of the G7 and will probably continue to buy Russian oil?
Yeah, I mean, the price cap on Russian oil is a sensible idea if it works. The point is the G7 represents the biggest group of customers, but there are other customers as well. So if India and China ignore the idea of a price cap, I mean, it might be in their interest, of course, because a price cap would keep it cheaper for everybody and put the onus back on the Russians. But if they choose to ignore it, and I suspect the Chinese will, the Indians might, then the price cap may simply not work. So it's a good idea if it works. It's a bad idea if it doesn't. And nobody knows. I mean, this is pretty unique politics for the buyers of a global product to say, we will only pay you this amount for it, even though we know that there are other buyers elsewhere in the world who might pay more.
And it was obviously going to antagonise Putin, that move.
Well, it was, yes, antagonism is built into the whole situation now. And the idea is to not give Putin as it were, the right to go first all the time. Why are we having to react to him? Why don't we put him on the spot? And so I think the idea was to sort of get ahead of the game a little bit and say, look, this is not all a one-way process. We, the G7, are the most important economies in the world. We're the biggest economies in the world collectively. We simply won't pay these prices and give him a problem to worry about. That was the idea. We'll see how it works out. But the fact that Nord Stream 1 is not going to reopen is absolutely no surprise to anybody. And whether or not this price cap had been announced or not at the G7, I don't think Nord Stream 1 was ever going to reopen again. We built that into our expectations. Nord Stream 2, remember, which was going to open before this war started, that's finished now forever. That'll never happen. Nord Stream 1 will be redundant now for probably, mainly redundant anyway, for the next 5 to 10 years. So forget it. The Nord Stream pipelines are finished. That's where we are.
What do you make of Tobias Ellwood's comments? We played it before we introduced you there, that a tactical nuclear weapon is likely to be used in the next decade. Do you agree with that assessment?
No, not in nuclear use, because this is not a nuclear crisis. I mean, the Cuba crisis in 1962, which was extremely dangerous, that was a nuclear crisis. It was about nuclear weapons. This is about legitimacy and territory and sovereignty and law. The fact that the Russians keep, as it were, rattling their nuclear weapons doesn't make this a nuclear crisis. And if you look at Russia's possible options, I mean, nuclear use wouldn't serve any of their purposes, either a tactical nuclear weapon against Ukrainian forces. They're only effective if the forces are concentrated, and the Ukrainian forces are not concentrated. And a bigger nuclear weapon, I think, would put the whole world against Russia. I mean, half the world is standing back to see what happens in this crisis. If the Russians used a nuclear weapon, I think they would find that 195 of the 196 members of the United Nations were thoroughly against them. It would be such a big threshold. So I don't think nuclear use is a realistic possibility. There's always a danger. There's always a danger that it might happen by accident. That danger is greater. But where I do agree with Tobias is the idea that this is not going to be a short war. We are in for an antagonism between Russia and Ukraine, and Russia and the rest of us, which is generational. So it'll go for 40, 50, 60 years. And what will happen is that the war in Ukraine will go through a series of ceasefires which break down into new wars. Remember, this is already the second war. The first war in Ukraine was 2014. This is war number 2. There'll probably be a ceasefire, I would guess, sometime next year. And that will last for 2 or 3 years. Then it will break down. There will be a third war in the late 2020s, then a ceasefire, and that will break down, and so on. So that
will go beyond Putin, you think?
For sure, yeah. It'll go to, I say for sure, very likely, because Putin will not be replaced by a nice man. I mean, the thing we're certain of, it will be a man, but nobody who is around Putin is likely to be that different. So we're playing for Putin, the next but one after Putin, if we're trying to get back on terms with Russia. But remember, it's not just Putin. It's Putin, the whole of the policy establishment, the Duma, the parliament, most of the media, quite a lot of the population in Russia now believe that Russia has a right, some sort of historical right, to reestablish the old Russian Empire. Now, we can argue about where that feeling comes from, but this is not all just Putin. There is something deep in the sort of state of Russia, as it's developed over the last 20-odd years, that is deeply imperialist. And so this struggle with Ukraine at the heart of it is generational. So it'll go for 2 or 3 generations, and we've just got to get used to that and learn how to manage it.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you for your time, Michael. That is Michael Clarke, former Director General of the Royal United Services Institute. Fascinating that he's saying there that the antagonism with Russia between Europe and Ukraine is going to continue for 40, 50 years. The next man, and he says it will be a man who takes over from Putin, will continue with this. There will probably be a ceasefire in Ukraine in the middle of next year. There might be some peace for 2 or 3 years, then another war, bit of peace, another war. And so it goes on, quite a sobering reflection. Yeah.